Hey everyone, so I've been asked a lot lately, different questions regarding God and the Bible and things like that. And I do all of these personal studies, so I figured why not record me talking about them uh, for anyone to watch. So for anyone regardless of faith or religion, or even just people who don't believe, agnostics, atheists, whatever. Anyone who has questions regarding the Bible, or just people who want to hear a different story or studies of certain Bible messages, I figured why not record me talking so it can kind of be like a personal, very low-key sort of Sunday school type thing. I am out in the bush currently, as you can see, and these are going to be very low edited, rather low effort type deals, but I just figured to do this as a way to not only help others out, but to also help me out in getting it to where if you hold yourself accountable to say something in public, it makes you more likely to do it. So this is that. This won't affect any of the other upload schedules. Videos won't change at all. This is just something in addition that I may start doing on Sundays as a little like ministry type thing. So if you want to watch, great. If you don't, that's also great. Thank you for checking out the channel. But like I said, this is just a personal thing, very low-key. I'm not going to be getting into debates on belief and religion and all that. It's just looking at individual Bible stories. So for this one, and things that can be gleaned from it, that anyone can apply to their life. So for this one, I wanted to talk about Samuel, and specifically his relationship with the first king, King Saul. Now, for those of you, well, for everyone, the way that it originally worked back in times before Jesus was whenever the children of God were set up or appointed, the Israelites, the children of Israel, they did not have a king. The way it worked is God was their king, and anything that they needed would be facilitated by God. So what would happen is whenever there were situations that someone had to come in and help Israel, because Israel had made way too many mistakes on their own, God would send what was known as a judge, and these judges would go forward on Israel's behalf to either defeat a king or lead an army or something of the like. So what we're seeing here, Samuel was the last judge of Israel. So where I'm going to start out the story, it's talking about him as a judge. So it starts in chapter 7. Let me make sure I got it right. A lot of this is probably going to be flipping through. Okay, so here we go. And it came to pass. This is also, if anyone wants to know for their personal sake, this is 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1. And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came unto Samuel at Ramah, which is the area Samuel was from, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, Give us a king to judge us, and Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, and all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they likewise unto thee. So, what's happened here is Samuel's sons have been bad judges after his manner. So the people say, we want to be just like everyone else. We understand that God is special and whatnot, but everyone else has a king, so we want to be like everyone else. That bird is very loud. So God says, all right, well, if they want another king, then they'll have another king. And it's very interesting, the wording used here, because as they said, we want to be like all the other nations. We want to be like everybody else, to have their problems and their issues, because we don't like God anymore. And God tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you as judge, they're rejecting me as king. So then, this is still God talking. He says, now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. This, to me, the next verses I'm about to read, is some of the most troubling and retrospective in all of Scripture, especially considering where we're at today, and kind of where, as far as we've fallen as people. Because it is Samuel warning the people what will happen to them if they decide to elect a king and to put a man in leadership over them. And this is what it says. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked him a king, and he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make him instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyard, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your manservants and your maidservants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you on that day. This is so heartbreaking, because Israel, God's people, didn't have to go through any of this. God's people did not know what it was like to have a wicked king that would take their men and make them fight their wars, or would take their daughters and make them be his bakers, or a tenth of whatever they had. But they wanted to be like everyone else. And as we see immediately, so Samuel gives that whole speech to them, right? And then they say, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. Samuel said unto the men of Israel, go ye every man into his city. So, Samuel told them so. He warned them. He said, if you decide to pick a king, if this is the route that you're going to go on, this is exactly what's going to happen to you. And as we find out in the stories that come later, and as those of us in the modern day can see, kings and men in control over other men rarely end well. There are mosquitoes out here. Get out. It rarely ends well. It normally comes down to people ruling over other people, which is not our intended purpose. And it's so heartbreaking, again, to read these verses, because it's showing what could have been if people decided to stay on the right. But then again, should, woulda, coulda, right? So anyway, that is Samuel initially talking to the people. Now, the first thing that happens is, let me make sure I get the verses right. Here we go. So, the first king that's elected over king of Israel is a man by the name of Saul. And he becomes the first king of God's people. And a mistake a lot of people make is they think that Saul was always destined to be evil, and that is not the case at all. Saul was a humble, goodly man. It says that he was a man of God, righteous, and he walked in his ways. However, that didn't stop Saul from falling into the trap that everyone else falls into, the trap that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, we see here his first mistake. Now, keep in mind, Saul has been a good king up until this point. Right, we're skipping forward a bit. He has done right by the people. He has been a good king. But then we get here. So, to summarize what's happening, they're about to start a battle with the enemy army. Let me make sure I got the first verse right. Yes. So Samuel, who so there's no longer judges because people have elected kings. So now we move from the age of judges into what's known as the age of prophets. So now prophets come, and they don't judge over the people of Israel. They simply prophesy and tell them what's going to come and tell them God's will and things. And several of the prophets are like Isaiah, Nathan, and here Samuel, who was the last judge, is also the first prophet. So Samuel is now the prophet telling the king, Saul, what to do before he goes into battle. So Saul's about to go into a battle with the Philistines, and Samuel tells him, do not start the battle until I show up, and I'll show up in 7 days. Until I show up in 7 days, I'm going to burn an offering before God, and then we can start the battle. So he tarried 7 days, this is talking about Saul, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed, but Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So what happened is, Saul has all the people gathered. He says, Samuel will be here after 7 days. 7th day comes, Samuel hasn't shown up yet. So the people start to leave. Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an offering, the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him that he might salute him. So it's the 7th day. Saul has all of his people in front of him. He's like, wait for Samuel to get here, but Samuel doesn't get there. So they start to leave, and Saul says, fine, I'll do it. It says, as soon as Saul had burnt the offering, then Samuel shows up. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, and here we go with the excuses, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. He has the audacity, the king does, to stand in front of a prophet and say, well, the people were leaving, and you weren't here yet, even though it's still technically 7 days. You weren't here when I wanted you to be here. And the Philistines were here, so the war's about to fight, and I haven't made an offering yet. So I forced myself to disobey and do it without you. And again, I want to make this clear to people who may not be too familiar with the Word of God and stuff like that. It's not like Samuel had any supernatural power. It's not like he was elevated among people. It's because the commandment of God was do not burn the offering until the prophet gets there, and he burned the offering without the prophet there. It wasn't because Saul disobeyed Samuel. It was because Saul disobeyed God. And Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. And the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. I want it to be clear, the image of Samuel, an old prophet in age, coming before the king and shaming him in front of his entire army of people, saying, because you messed up, this is no longer your kingship, and it will go to someone else. So Saul, I'm going to skip ahead again. Saul fights the army. He repents, and God, as he's often called, is the God of second chances. So God says, all right, you're reinstated as king. So you would expect that Saul would appreciate this opportunity that he's been given. No, he didn't. The next battle, we see the next mess up that he gets into. So, what happens in the next battle, they're fighting a different army. It's called the Amalekites, another enemy of the people. So the Amalekites were incredibly wicked. They were laying waste to cities. They were doing unspeakable things to people. They were absolutely evil. So Samuel told Saul specifically, this is a commandment of God, do not spare anything living with the Amalekites. When you get to the Amalekite city, do not spare the women, the children, the men. Make sure you kill all of the animals as well, every one of them. Do not let anything of the Amalekites live. So you would expect Saul, who is already on his second chance, to do what God said. So what does Saul do? And Saul came to the city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. And Saul said unto the Kenites, Go, depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. Hold up, I want to skip forward a bit. All right, yeah, so verse 7. Oh, sorry. I forget I'm not been mentioning verses. This is 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 7. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag the king of the Amalekites alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So he kept the king alive, because that's what kings do, right? Because he thought that as a king, he should do what kings do and not what God says. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, and the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. So he goes through, he keeps the king alive, and then he also decides to keep alive everything that... There's squirrels behind me. He decides to also keep alive everything... Or Wendigos. He decides also to keep alive everything that they can use. So the ox, the sheep, that he figures, well, I know God said to kill all of them, but we could use some of these. So they decide to keep them. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments, and it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. I think this part's also very special and needs to be noted, because it says that when Samuel found out, the God told him, It repented me that I made Saul king over Israel. It says Samuel cried all night. Because Samuel loved his people. So it wasn't like he wanted to see Saul fail just because he was rejected. He loved Saul too. He wanted the best to happen for them. But Saul kept messing up, and he knew what that means. So Samuel cried before the Lord all night. It says, And when Samuel rose early to meet with Saul in the morning, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, set him up a place, and has gone about and passed on, and gone down to Gilgal. So Samuel gets up, he goes, finds where Saul's at. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said unto him, Blessed be thou of the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Samuel knows he hasn't done what God said. And in one of the sassiest lines in the Bible, Samuel says, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? Literally, if you killed all the sheep and ox, why do I hear sheep and ox? He's standing there in front of the town that Saul was supposed to destroy, as Saul has all the sheep and ox gathered together. And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people, not me, the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have destroyed utterly. Not only is he justifying disobeying God, he's justifying it through God. He said that we spared the sheep and oxen so that we can make sacrifices to God. Which, not only did he do wrong, he did wrong and then blamed God for it, which sadly is kind of a common trend we see. Then Samuel said unto Saul, Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord hath said unto me this night. And he said unto him, Say on. So I want you to picture this. Samuel is an old man, an old prophet, in front of the king. And the whole king's army is there in the city that the king just destroyed. And the prophet is standing there, and he points at the king and says, Stay here, and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And Samuel said, When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? And the Lord sent thee on a journey and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil, and did evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said unto Samuel, Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. He straight up lied in front of Samuel. But the people, again, not me, he keeps passing the blame off. The people took of the spoil sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. Saul is both blaming the people for not destroying all the animals, and then using the excuse that it's for God. And Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. So he is saying that these sacrifices mean nothing if you did the wrong thing to get them. And this is, again, very applicable for what we see in common life. People will do bad things and justify it, with either the best intentions or the ends justify the means or something like that. But they try to look over all the evil that they step to get to where they are. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. So he's saying that what Saul's done is comparable to witchcraft, which, with what we're going to get into in a second, is very ironic. But again, this is an example of people doing the wrong things and trying to justify it. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. And Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed. Saul is finally admitting, it's my bad, I have sinned, I have transgressed. The commandment of the Lord and thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. He's still passing blame. Now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin, and turn again with me, that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel said unto Saul, I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord hath rejected thee from being king over Israel. So he straight up said to Saul's face, you've rejected God, so now God's going to reject you. He's going to find himself a different king. And Samuel turned about to go away, and he laid hold upon his skirt of his mantle, and it rent. And Samuel said unto him, the Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to this neighbor of thine, that is better than thou. So, Saul messed up the second time, and this time Samuel said, this is it. This old prophet standing before the king of his people, he rips his clothes in half and says, as this is rent, God has rent the kingdom from your hands, which is an absolute power and boldness that's rarely seen, but should absolutely be sought after. I want to skip forward a bit because I think this part's amazing. So keep in mind that Samuel, the old prophet, is still in front of the king, who is now on his face crying, and the whole king's army is behind him. Then said Samuel, bring ye hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites, the king that Saul was supposed to kill. And Agag came unto him delicately, and Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. So this old prophet looks at the army of the king crying in front of him and says, bring me the king he spared. This king comes out, Agag, the evil king, and says, surely the bitterness of death is past. You're not still mad, are you? You don't want to kill me. And here's what Samuel said. And Samuel said, as thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag into pieces before the Lord. In front of the king, he calls out the other king, cuts him into pieces, after saying, you made women childless, your mother will now be childless. Which, again, this boldness and this ferocity we see. So after this, and for the purpose of what I want to look at here, I'm going to skip over it. It's very important, very interesting, but we move into David. David is Saul's successor. He is the righteous man who God picks to be king in Saul's place. Well, Saul goes absolutely crazy after this. It says, because of his actions, the Spirit of the Lord departs from him, and he essentially becomes a tyrant, if he wasn't already. So David is biding his time. There's animals behind me. David is biding his time, waiting for the Lord to essentially just, whenever God makes me king, then it'll be my time to be king. In the meantime, Saul's absolutely losing it. He gets the entire government's army to hunt down David and try to kill him. He several times tries to murder David in the palace. This goes on for quite some time. Throughout the whole thing, Samuel is being a coach to David, but Samuel departs from Saul. Samuel's no longer his advisor because Samuel's a man of God. And because God departed from Saul, Samuel is now coaching David on the right track. So then when we get to chapter 25, in verse 1, it says, And Samuel died. And Samuel was old, he died of age. And all of the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in the house at Ramah. So we see here that Samuel's dead. Now, what I think is important to look at is it has been a long time at this point that Samuel has ever spoken to Saul. But Saul's mental state keeps getting worse, and Saul himself keeps getting worse. So eventually, Saul gets desperate. He can't kill David. He's afraid that David's going to take the throne. And the Philistines, one of the enemies from before, are about to invade Israel. So Saul's panicking. So he does something he really shouldn't have done. Now Samuel was dead. And all is, I'm skipping forward a few chapters here. There's more about David in between. This is 1 Samuel chapter 28 in verse 3. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. So, what it says there, familiar spirits, that is witchcraft. That is people who try to bring people back from the dead. That was those who tried to talk to demons. Back then, it's its own study in itself, but spirits and sorcery and all that was very different. So people essentially practiced dark arts. And those of familiar spirits are essentially people that talk to the dead. So witchcraft, evil. And Saul had made that punishable by death, or at least you'd be cast out. But he gets desperate. And when Saul saw that the host of the Philistines, the enemy army, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not. Because remember, Saul's been cut off. Neither by the dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Then said Saul unto his servants, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself, and put on other raiment, and he went, and to me, ow, there was a spider in my pants that bit me. Ow. I'm going to get through this. Anyway, mosquitoes everywhere. Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. And the woman said unto him, Behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? So this woman straight up tells him, don't you know, Saul goes in the cover of night to a witch's house. And the witch tells him, don't you know that Saul is killing people for doing this? Not knowing she's talking to Saul. And Saul says, don't worry, nothing bad will happen to you, trust me. She even accuses him of being a snare, so essentially a narc set up to trick her into talking to Saul. I'm afraid that there's other things out here. We're at the end anyway, so don't worry. So he goes to this witch and says, I need you to talk to a spirit. And the woman said, whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, bring me up Samuel. It's been a long time since Samuel's talked to Saul, and Samuel's been dead. But even now, he goes to a witch and says, bring me the spirit of Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And the woman spake to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. She figured out who he was. And the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up. And he is covered with a mantle, and Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. Samuel said to Saul, I'm getting stuff all over me. And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed. For the Philistines make war against me, and God is departed from me, and answereth me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. This prophet of the Lord comes back from the dead and says in a booming voice, with gods ascending out of the earth, as she talked about, so spirits and creatures, and he says to him, Why hast thou disquieted me? And Samuel says, God won't talk to me anymore. or sorry, Saul says, God won't talk to me anymore. And hold up, I lost my verse. It's getting dark out. Wherefore then said Samuel, wherefore then dost thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and is become thine enemy? When a prophet from the dead tells you that God is your enemy, that is a very bad thing. And the Lord hath done to him as he spake by me, for the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand, and given it to thy neighbor, even to David. That kid you've been trying to kill so he won't become king, he will become king because God allowed it. Because thou obeyest not the voice of the Lord, nor executest his fierce wrath upon Amalek, the king we talked about earlier, therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. So again, we see Saul mess up. This is his third. Well, he messed up a lot of times in between. I skipped over, but his third time with Samuel. He goes to the point. He goes to a witch. It has Samuel's soul conjured up, and Samuel tells him, "You've gone too far. You've tried to kill the man of God, and now you're speaking to a witch to talk to me. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me, and you will lose the battle." And guess what happened the next day? Saul and his sons were killed in battle, and Israel lost to the Philistines. Then it took David, who was to be the next king, to come together, get an army, and eventually they drove them out. But because several lives were lost and brutality came because of Saul's iniquity, it all started when the people of Israel said, "Let us be like everyone else and let us have a king." And regardless of what Samuel said, who essentially had an "I told you so," the people perished by their own doing. And we see here in the end that the man who stayed righteous through this whole story was that man Samuel. And I think that it is completely important for us to focus on and for us to try to figure out that spirit, the idea of calling out the wicked, where it's seen even in high places, is not only something to be sought after, but something that we should desire and look for in ourselves. So I want to share the story for the idea that we may have the boldness of Samuel and those people who were not afraid to call out evil where we see fit. So that was just a short little study about Samuel and Saul. I'll probably make a playlist out of these when there's a couple. Thank you all for listening. If this is just totally something that I felt like doing on a whim, and I think there needs to be more of, so I wanted to get this out here essentially. And again, thank you all. It really does mean a lot. So thank you to my patrons. I do not have any electricity out here right now besides the camera to get their names. I will have a list for the patrons' names next time, but thank you to all my patrons. It really does mean a lot. And thank you guys for watching. So appreciate it, and goodbye.